So now we're on Kuf Tes Zayin Amid Beis. Right, so we're dealing with Mamid Or Shel Keva, and the Mishnah says the following: in Yesh Beno Sein Tam. If, let's say, you would give the cheese to a kfela, which a non-Jewish chef to taste, and lo and behold, he says that there's a flavor here of meat coming from the skin, the lining of the abamasa, asura. But if, on the other hand, you don't taste anything, or alternatively, if you don't have a chef to taste it, you have shishim against the lining, against the skin, then it's mutter. Now the Mishnah goes on to discuss and address another issue. What happens if you have a calf and it suckles, nurses from its mother cow, but the cow is a treifa? And now you shecht the calf, and lo and behold, you find milk. That milk was taken from the treifa, and therefore, kevasa asura. Now, again, it's a little bit tricky because you see the word kevasa, but it doesn't say arshal keva. We're not dealing again with the issue of the skin. We're not making cheese now. What we're doing is we want to know if we can drink the milk that we find inside the abamasim of the calf or the kid. And the answer is, since its mother, from which it was nursed, is a treifa, then the milk is treif. And you can't drink the milk that you find inside. So I think that bears out with what we've been saying until now. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even though the mother cow is a kosher animal, but it's irrelevant because it's a treifa. It has some sort of inner puncture. But now let's take the opposite case. And if our logic can be taken to its conclusion, then if you have a treifa animal, like a calf or a goat, a kid, I mean, that nurses from its mother, and the mother cow or goat is not a treifa, but a kshera. So now you shecht, or whatever you do, you open the calf, and lo and behold, you find milk there. But the milk is inside the animal of a treifa, uteres, because that milk comes from its mother, and the mother is not a treifa. This is what the Gemara sometimes calls mifkad pocket. I don't know if you ever heard of that phrase. Mifkad pocket means it's like in a separate sack. It's not really part and parcel of the treifa of the calf, through and through. Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to analyze the opening section of our Mishnah, which has two cases, if you recall. Kevas Oved Kochavim and Kevas Nevela. Why the need for both of them? Right? We open up the stomach and we find milk in the stomach. So the Gemara asks, Atu Kevas Oved Kochavim Lav Nevela? I mean, this animal that was shechted or killed by the owner who's an akum is an nevela. And now you're going to tell me nevela? I mean, you've already told me nevela, so why do you have to tell me kevas akum? So again, ultimately, what we have to analyze is whether or not the milk is a separate entity. If you remember, if I find it in a nevela of a kosher animal, then if I view the milk, well, let's say I find it in a nevela, right? So the nevela is asur. But is the milk part and parcel of the nevela, or is it a separate entity? So that's why I need a chiddush of nevela. Amar Rav Huna, akum askinon, right? So the Jew buys a kid from an akum, and afterwards he shechts it, and he finds milk. Chayshinan shemiyonak min atreifa. Right, the guy doesn't care two hoots where this kid nursed and drank the milk of a kosher animal or non-kosher animal. So maybe this is the chalav of a treifa, which we said in the Sefer of the Mishnah, that if you find milk that came from the cow and the cow is a treifa, then the milk is awesome. So this becomes a very unique problem when you buy an animal from, right, a nursing animal from an akum, because maybe the animal nursed from milk that's non-kosher. You don't have that issue in the case of a kosher animal that was raised by a Jew. So the Gemara says, what are the chances are that this animal, this kid or calf that you purchased from the akum, nursed from a treifa? Well, if that be the case, how can we buy eggs from the goyim? The basic kashrus issues. Ein choshin lo mishum nevela, lo mishum treifa. We don't worry about the possibility that this is an egg of a treifa. If it's an egg of a treifa, it's asur. Yotzim and asur. Because most animals out there in the wild are not doomed to die. You know, they don't have punctures in their inner organs. So the halacha doesn't have to consider the possibility that maybe it's a treifa. And therefore the Gemara rejects this. Ella ema chayshinen shemiyonak min atmeya. Well, there are a lot of animals out there that are non-kosher. So maybe this animal that you purchased from the guy suckled its milk from a non-kosher animal. And once again, it's yotzim and asa. So Gemara immediately asks the naive question: we're not afraid that maybe it's suckled from a treifa, but maybe it's suckled from a non-kosher animal. And the answer is very simple: treifa lo shchicha. Most animals are healthy; they're not dying. But tmeya shchicha, there are a lot of non-kosher animals out there. By the way, is it true that all animals have milk? All female animals have milk? The camels and swine, I guess they...
All mammals.
What?
All mammals.
Mammals. So let's say, for example, is a horse a mammal? So does a pony or whatever it's called nurse from the mother horse? What about a seal? Somebody once told me that a seal is a mammal. No?
No, seals, I think. Whales.
All right, anyway, this is for AI. So now the Gemara raises the following objection. Ishchicha, if you're telling me that non-kosher animals are all over the place, is afilu gabi didan nechush. Maybe I raised a calf or a kid, but that calf or a kid suckled from a non-kosher animal. And the answer the Gemara says is Ananda Badlina Minayu, we don't deal with non-kosher animals. So the cattle farmer or whatever it is, he doesn't have any pigs floating around. I mean, if we see that a calf is about to suckle from a swine, then what do? We don't want to get this problem with the non-kosher milk, so we separate the calf. Tell him tell Mr. Calf or Mrs. Calf, just nurse from your cow, your mother cow. And therefore, lo gozu be'rabbanon, the inu lo b'diliminayu. But on the other hand, when it's a guy, then he doesn't care one way or the other whether the animal suckles from a non-kosher animal, a kosher animal. If he sees it suckling, I think the Gemara is kind of bavar that maybe you would think that the guy wants to sell it to a Jew, so he wants to make sure that the Jew won't have questions about the milk. The Gemara says no. We have to worry about the fact that maybe there are all sorts of non-kosher animals over there, and I mean this, in my mind, again, I don't know beans about zoology, but I wonder how common is it, to have a nursing situation between one species and another. In other words, balabatish, just without knowing anything about science, I would think that a calf would rather suckle from its mother cow than from a swine. But maybe that's not so, Anyway. Okay. So now again, we're going back to the drawing board on explaining what the difference is between the akum in the first case and the nevela in the second case. Shmuel Omer Chada Ketani. They're not two cases. You have to read it as one long case. Kevas, shchitas, ovikochav, nevela. In other words, if you dig up this milk that's in the abusama of an animal that was raised by and shechted by a guy, then it has the same status as an nevela. And we're assuming that the milk is part and parcel of the nevela. ומי אמר שמואל הכי ואמר שמואל מפני מה עשו גבינס עובי כוכבים מפני שמעמידים עושה ביער כבש נבלה. The whole problem with buying non-kosher cheese, meaning cheese from non-Jews, is because when they do the process of cheese making, they take that enzyme, right, which is called renin, I'll get it eventually, and they use it for the cheese making. That's what Shmuel says. So the Gemara's medayik. All Shmuel is careful about is the process of curdling the milk, of making cheese. He's not worried about the milk itself. And therefore, it would seem that the rennet, which is the milk itself in the abomasin, is permissible. I guess if you assume that what? If you assume that the milk is inside a kosher animal. Now, admittedly, the animal died without shechita, right? The guy shechted the animal. But the milk is a separate entity. And it's not part of the nevela. And therefore Shmuel was matir. So what are we going to do with our Mishnah? Mishnah says it's asur. Lo kasha kan kodem chazor, kan liacher chazor. Okay. So what time is it now? Oh my gosh. Okay. Because at this point, we need I'm exaggerating, but we need a 15-minute introduction. So for this, we have to know that there's machlokas between Rabbi Yoshua and the Chachamim. I'm trying to remember which Tana specifically rejects Rabbi Yoshua, but Rabbi Yoshua is of the opinion that the milk in a nevela is nevela, meaning it's part and parcel of the meat of the animal, which is nevela. But ultimately, I think it's Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry, on Shabbos I learned two blats, so I don't know. So I think it's Rabbi Akiva who rejects Rabbi Yoshua. And what's his proof? No, not Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel. This is all in Avodah Zarah Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis. And Rabbi Shmuel proves it from an Ola. And Rabbi Yeshua retracts his original position. So our Mishnah reflects the original position of Rabbi Yeshua that the milk inside the amamasim is part and parcel of the nevela, and therefore it's asur. Whereas Shmuel goes like the maskana, the final conclusion, after Yeshua himself actually concedes that he was wrong, and therefore the milk is a separate entity, and if it's part of a kosher animal, even though the animal is now a nevela, it's not nevela. Now, this distinction between Kodem Chazara and Liacher Chazara is going to come up over and over again. So let's say, for example, the Mishnah says, Kshera sheyonka min atreifa. So what do you have? You have milk, which we called rennet, in a kosher animal. So what's the problem? The problem is that the milk itself came from a treifa, because the kids suckled from a treif animal, and as the cow was about to die. Frek the Gemara, v'ktani reisha kevas ove kochavim, v'shel nevela harezu asura. One second. So let me just go back to the Mishnah for a second. Sheresh yonkom in atreifa is kevasa asura. Just 1 second. You see, it's a little tricky because in the printed text of our Gemara, it only mentions Ksheresh Yonkom and Atreifa. But then it says V'chule. You see that? Because now the Gemara is focused on the next part of the Mishnah, which says that Treifa Sheyonkom and Akshera Kevasa Muteres. Why? Because the milk came from a kosher animal. Right? The treifa animals suckled from a kosher mother. And therefore the milk itself is mutter. So the Gemara asks, doesn't that contradict the Reisha? Why? Because what underlies the Reisha? That since the animal of the guy is an avela, because his shechita makes it into an avela, therefore the milk is considered part and parcel of the avela, and therefore it's asura. So now in our case, the treifa suckled from its kosher mother, but the milk now becomes part of the animal that's suckled, meaning the treifa, and now it should be treif. Why does the Mishnah say it's okay? Rav Chizda, Reisha, Nireka Ochel Nevelis. This is all D'Rabbanan. Meaning, technically speaking, if we assume that just 1 second, again, just got to get the case one more time. If we assume that the milk is a separate entity, and therefore we were matir in the Sefer, but in the Reisha, doesn't look so kosher. Right? You took the milk out of a nevela, of a guy, But hacha, ika shchita. But here, we're talking about a kosher animal. You went ahead and you shechted it, and no one's going to think that it came from a non-kosher animal. Amalei Rav v'alav kol shkein uman nevela demeisa. Most people don't like to eat a nevela. It's repugnant. Di sharisle kevasa. We don't have to worry about the possibility that if you're going to allow a person to drink the milk inside the nevela, he's going to come to eat the nevela. The nevela is repugnant. Is amrit lo. And nevertheless, you said that you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink the milk. Is treifa shchuta disharis osi lemechol minei lo kolshke. And if you went ahead and you shechted a treifa, which is mitayr midei nevela, but it's a valid shchita to some extent, and therefore it's not repugnant, then how much more so we have to be worried that maybe he'll come to eat the treifa itself. Elam Rav Yisrael Rav Lo kasha kan kodem chazor kai liacher chazor. This is what we've been waiting for. The punchline again. That the Mishnah in the Reisha reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua before he backtracked and conceded, and therefore, in the case of Kevas Akum, we view it as part and parcel of the Nevela, not a separate entity, and therefore it's awesome. But the Seifa, right? The Seifa, in the case of what? Of a Treifa Shiyonka Minakshera, we don't see it as part and parcel of the Treifa because we're now after the Chazara of Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua conceded based on Rabbi Shmuel's argument from Ola, which hopefully we'll get to at some point, that it's a separate entity and therefore you're allowed to drink the milk. Right, so you find the milk in the nevela, right? So it's a kosher animal, but a nevela, and we're assuming after Chazara that Rabbi Yeshua conceded to Rabbi Shmuel that the milk that you find inside the nevela is mutter, and now that milk could serve as a curdling agent to be mamid cheese. But and that's going to be again a drabana. Well, we'll see in a minute. Oh, now we introduce the problem of avodah zarah. And because we assume that the shchita was done for the sake of idolatry, for a sacrifice. And even though the Akum did not necessarily declare that he's interested in sacrificing the animal, but stam, we assume that he's doing it for the sake of idol worship. Therefore, everything becomes also, and you can't benefit at all from this animal. And you certainly can't benefit from the rennet that you find inside the abamaisin of this animal that was slaughtered by the Akum. Amalei, Reb Chia responds to Rabbi Lazar. I'm sorry, to Reb Shimon bar Abba, just to get the name straight. Ela Kaman. I mean, why did you bother telling me that which is absolutely obvious, that we must be reflecting the Shita here in Mishnah of Rabbi Lezer, that Stam Machshavas Hovi Kochavim Lavodas Kochavim. Okay, so that's that. And now, the Gemara says, Ki Osir of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Rav Yochanan. Okay, they came to Babel from Eretz Yisrael, the name Rav Yochanan, Mamidim Bein bekevas nevela, bein bekevas shchitas ovid kochav. So you find the milk inside the abamasim of a nevela, or inside the abamasim of an animal that was slaughtered by an akum, which means it's nevela, and you're allowed to use that to curdle your cheese. Why? So we don't assume that there's an Isra Avodah Zarah here because the Akum B'stam Machshava had in mind the sacrifice. The Hilchas, however, L'chumra, we paskin that Eima Mida Bi'or Kevas Nevela. We're not going to use the skin of a nevela because the skin of a nevela is basar and it's nevela, and that's going to generate a tam in the curdled cheese, but mabida bekevas nevela. Right? If you find milk inside the nevela, we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua's final conclusion that it's not part of the nevela, and therefore it's a separate entity, and therefore it's mutter, and you could use it for curling your cheese. Ubekeva shchitas ovekachavim. I guess he's assuming that we rejected Rabbi Eliezer, who held that it's an avodah zarah problem. Kevas kshera sheyonkom in a treifa. And once again, we're going to apply that same reasoning that the milk itself is kosher. Just 1 second. Yonkom in a treifa. Yonkom in a treifa. Oh, so this is Pirsha B'Alma. We didn't get to the Maskana. It's coming around the bend. The Kolch can be Kevis Treifish Yonkom and Aksheru, which doesn't have a problem at all because the milk is a separate entity. But my timer, what's the justification for the case of Kevas Kshershi Yonkom in a Treifa? Because there the milk came from the Treifa. And the answer is because it gets digested. Cholav mechunas ba pirsha bi'almahu. It's refuse. When the milk turned into rennet, even though, it might have been a problem originally, but it's digested waste. And even the rennet found in the abdomen of a kid that was suckled from a treifa is permitted because it's refuse. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Kuf Tes Vav Amid Beis. But just hang in there for 1 second, if you don't mind.